Hello everybody, welcome to TCOM 408. This is video number 5. I'm Dr. Mike Gerhard from the Department of Telecommunications at Ball State. Hello, I hope you are well today. In the last video we looked at ethical theories that focus on virtue and character development. In this video we'll shift the focus to theories that focus on our duties, our obligations, not only to ourselves, but to each other and society. So our focus in this video will be on our duties and obligations. Now, of course, we are experiencing a global event, the pandemic of 2020, and we can relate this to some of the ideas in this video. What are your duties and obligations during the crisis? As a citizen, as a good citizen, what are your duties and obligations? And what about the media companies and the tech companies? Do they have specific moral obligations and duties during the coronavirus pandemic? Well, of course they do, and we'll talk about some of those obligations later in this video. But first, we need to differentiate between two broad ethical perspectives: deontological theories versus teleological theories. These are big words, but the concepts are fairly simple: deontological and teleological. Okay, a deontological theory isn't concerned with the consequences or the outcomes of some action. No, it's based on the duties that are morally required of all of us. Deon is the Greek word for duty. It's the idea of doing your duties. This is also called an absolutist approach. People who follow this approach tend to see these duties and obligations as absolutes. It's something that you don't find loopholes for or compromise. Now, another way to look at ethics is to focus on the outcomes of our actions. This perspective is called the teleological perspective or theory, and it's one that says that the right or wrong is measured by consequence or outcomes, also called consequentialist theory, and we'll examine that theory in an upcoming video. But in this video, we want to focus in on our moral duties. So, deontological theories emphasize your duties and obligations to the world. Now, what are the duties? What are the obligations? Well, so we can trace many of these back through time immemorial to some of the great early religious texts and religious teaching. One aspect of this duty theory is the idea of divine command theory. This is the theory that an act is obligatory because it's commanded to us by God, by the Great Spirit, by the great divine power of the universe. Where do we learn about these duties and obligations? Well, they come to us from the great religious texts, the Bible of Christianity, the Torah of the Jewish faith, and the Quran. That's the religious text, of course, of Islam. So these commandments, these duties, are explained to us in the great religious texts, the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. An example that you're all familiar with, you probably learned about this as a child, the Ten Commandments, the famous Ten Commandments, a list of religious moral imperatives, obligations, duties that were written by God and given to Moses to share with the rest of us. You're probably familiar with these commandments. Some of them are very relevant to me even today. Of course, we should honor our parents. We shouldn't murder. We shouldn't commit adultery, steal, or lie. The basic commandments. Now, if you examine the religious text, you'll find other commandments for our behaviors as well. Any problems with divine command theory? Well, yeah, some of us might not believe in God or a higher power or a divine authority. And let's say you believe in God. Who's God? Which God? And sometimes the duties and obligations presented, for example, in the Bible might conflict. And then what do we do in those situations? And of course, these old religious texts can't possibly help us deal with every single specific problem in the modern world, although maybe you argue they can help us solve every problem. Anyway, the one part of the religious teachings that I especially admire, and just even if you don't believe in God, I wouldn't dismiss the Bible or the religious text because they're full of great suggestions and ideas about ethics and how we treat each other. I especially like the agape ethics that focus on love and mercy and caring about others. To me, this should be a part of our ethical framework. So there are a lot of interesting biblical teachings, okay, that provide us instructions or ideas about our duties and obligations. Faith, hope, and charity, fidelity, honesty, the notion of the supreme worth of every person, or ideas like respect and humility and unconditional love, forgiveness, the golden rule. There's a great rule for us to follow. Generosity, the idea of living a moral life. All these concepts come from the Bible, and many of them are still important today and can guide our ethical decisions. Maybe we could look at a couple of scriptures that might help us deal with specific ethical situations. Are you familiar with this one? The idea of unconditional love, loving your neighbor as yourself. It's very difficult to do sometimes, especially if we have negative feelings about the other person. This is a duty. Maybe this should be a universal duty, a moral imperative that we should all follow. The golden rule. Here's a great example of a rule or a duty. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You're familiar with it. This is called the ethic of reciprocity, the golden rule. It's a fundamental moral value. Simply means you treat others the way that you would like to be treated. You know, if you get into an ethical dilemma, sometimes you can find the answer right here. Just make your decision based on the golden rule. And please don't think that the Christians have a monopoly on the golden rule. This is universal. This appears in every single faith and culture across the planet. Very universal, the golden rule. And some version of it is mentioned in Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Christianity, even native spirituality. And of course, Judaism and Islam. But this is universal ethical principle, the golden rule. And this is pretty good moral imperative or duty to have. And the world would be much better if everybody would embrace the golden rule. And so this is a moral duty or imperative that more folks should certainly follow. All right, let's talk a little bit about the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, because he is a very important figure in terms of the development of the idea of duty and obligations. So Kant believed it was so important to do your duty, and he really emphasized the importance of duties and obligations in terms of leading a good life, a good moral life. And Kant thought in terms of moral absolutes. He said you need to identify your duties and obligations and then follow those rigidly. Duty, he said, is the essential moral value, and especially duty to other people. That's at the core of ethical behavior, your duties and obligations. So in Kantian ethics, the focus is on your duties, not the outcomes or the consequences, not the idea of virtue or character development or true happiness. The idea is about doing your duty. Okay? And duties are absolute obligations that you have to fulfill, regardless of your personal feelings, whatever inclinations you have. Okay, you still need to fulfill your duties. So Kant's most important concept was probably the idea of the categorical imperative. These are the moral imperatives, the absolute duties. I like to think of these as kind of the most important do's and don'ts. Okay, our moral imperatives. So a categorical imperative, it's a moral obligation, a moral imperative that's imposed on us no matter what the circumstances or no matter what our personal desires might be. Here's how Kant put it. He said, act only according to that maxim or rule by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Let's simplify this. Another way of saying this, if you think everybody else should follow the rules, then you should too. Can you identify any obligations, moral imperatives, categorical imperatives, especially as they relate to the media world and the tech world, the worlds of news, entertainment, advertising, and all the content that's produced and aimed at children? What specific obligations do the media have? Are there moral imperatives in the media world? I believe there's a handful of them. Now, my list of moral imperatives reflects my values, so you don't have to agree with any of these items. And you can put different priorities and rank these in whatever way you want. I don't intend to imply any ranking here. This is just a list. To me, these are all important. Okay? But I really believe the media industries have an absolute duty to tell the truth in the world of news and advertising. I believe the media have an obligation to promote diversity and multiculturalism and pluralism. I believe the media have an obligation to protect children and to follow the rating system and to endorse the rating system. I believe that we all have an obligation to protect the environment, to care about the mothership, and to care about issues like sustainability and environmental protection. I believe the media companies have a moral duty to protect our privacy and our data privacy. I think the media companies have an obligation, of course, to engage in ethical, honest business practices. And I personally believe that all the media workers should promote democracy and the First Amendment, understand the importance of freedom of expression in a free and democratic society, and to be willing to advocate and to fight for those freedoms. So you don't have to agree with my list of moral imperatives. Come up with your own list, okay? And I'm sure that list will reflect your values, what you feel are obligations and duties that you feel are the most important. All right, let's apply some of these ideas to the current coronavirus crisis or the great pandemic, the great shutdown of 2020. What obligations, first, do citizens have? Do you have during the coronavirus outbreak? What are your duties? I can think of a few moral or imperatives or important duties for citizens during the pandemic. First and foremost, to practice all those public health safeguards. We've been given directions on how to behave during the crisis, to stay at home, to wear masks, to wash our hands, etc. We really need to follow those safeguards. How about the idea of reaching out to those in need? The pandemic has produced a horrible economic situation that's left a lot of people in economic and financial need and in economic insecurity. And so it's important, if we're given a lot, to be able to give back to the world, to pay it forward, to help people in need. How about the obligation to stay informed and up to date? How can we take good actions If we don't have the best information, the accurate information, and trustworthy information, so it's up to us to turn to reliable, trustworthy news sources and not to engage in the sharing of misinformation, conspiracy, and falsehoods. How about following the golden rule? Well, that's always important, but I think it's especially important during a time of crisis to have patience and to treat other people with respect in the way that we would want to be treated. Maybe you can think of other moral imperatives, duties, obligations that each one of us has during the pandemic. What about the media and the tech companies, the industries? What obligations and duties do the media companies have during the pandemic? I'm sure you can think of a few. And for me, here's some of the moral obligations that the companies have. If they're engaged in news and journalism and advertising, then they should tell us the truth. Okay? In the world of news and in advertising, think about it. A lot of, during a crisis, a health crisis, there's going to be a lot of scam products out there in the marketplace and treatments. And so the companies that have an obligation, I think, to screen the advertisements and the news media content to make sure that it's honest. How about making sure the employees are safe and secure? I think that's a moral obligation to make sure that the workplaces are safe and that the employees have some financial security during a difficult economic time. How about the idea of the obligation to help people who are suffering, of philanthropy, beneficence, giving back, to whom much is given, much is expected, especially during a time of crisis. Other imperatives maybe that you can think of for companies. It's interesting, during a crisis or a pandemic, we really see learn a lot about human beings and the human condition and who's good and who's not. Okay? People will stand up right now and show incredible character. Other people will show weakness. Now, categorical imperatives, moral duties, obligations. According to Kant, these are so important. And there's a few fundamental ones like truth and fairness. And that these obligations to truth and fairness should guide our ethical decisions. And Kant believed that we can't ever justify unethical behavior by just looking at the outcome. That's a different theoretical perspective. Now, Kant, one idea I really like from Kantian ethics is the idea of not using people, not walking all over people to get what we want. Kant promoted the Judeo-Christian value of seeing people as an important end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. So the way he said it was, act so you treat humanity always as an end and never only as a means. So this means the ends do not justify the means. You can't use people and walk all over people just to achieve your goals. That is, if you're following these Kantian ethics or these duty-based ethics. So that's all I have in this lecture. In the next video, we'll continue to talk about more of these duty-based theories and ideas. I hope you continue to take care of yourself. We'll see you again next time. Stay safe, everybody. So long.